Welcome to the historical 156-foot tall Bodie Lighthouse. This lighthouse is recognized by its horizontal stripes. It takes roughly 400 gallons of paint to paint the lighthouse every 5 to 7 years, and each stripe is roughly 22 feet tall.
I see these two going like...
In this video, we'll walk all the way to the top so you get to generally see every feature. This stairwell leads into the base of the lighthouse, and the walls here are 5 feet 8 inches thick.
Yes, this is a set.
There are 214 steps to the top of the lighthouse, and these steps are built fairly close. The Park Service requires that you take no more than 2 steps at a time in order to preserve the staircase for future generations. I believe they made a comparison that if you were wearing high heels and stepped up 3 steps at once, the heel would have the equivalent of 2,000 psi. However accurate that is, over time it would probably damage the steps. And as we'll discuss later, renovations were difficult and expensive. The lighthouse stands on Bodie Island. At the time, it extended from Roanoke Inlet to 9.5 miles south. Most North Carolinians pronounce it as Bodie, but it is pronounced Bodie. The name comes from a man named Robert Bodie, who came from London in the 1600s and settled in Virginia. Years later, still in the 1600s, his descendants settled in the Outer Banks area. I'm not positive about the prominence of his family, but I do know that the name was used as early as 1709 in a book called A New Voyage to Carolina by John Lawson. He was looking for English rabbits. A quote from the book reads, "I was told of several that were upon Bodie's Island by Roanoke, which came from the ship of Bodies, but I never saw any." He was referring to Roanoke, of course. Now, most people don't realize that the Outer Banks are constantly changing. Without the machinery, the barriers, and the dunes, the Outer Banks could look different almost every year. History shows the island formed around 1738 when New Inlet opened, which separated Bodie and Hatteras Island. Skipping ahead to 1846, a hurricane opened the now famous Oregon Inlet, which split Bodie Island in half. The north portion of the island remained Bodie, and the south portion became Pea Island. And by 1933, New Inlet had closed again, combining Pea Island back with Hatteras Island. And Bodie Island became part of the 70-mile peninsula connecting with Virginia. In 1934, Roosevelt's New Deal called for building artificial dunes all the way to Ocracoke Inlet. You still see these dunes maintained today. So back to the lighthouse. As shipping increased along the East Coast, so did the amount of tragic shipwrecks, which gave the Outer Banks the nickname Graveyard of the Atlantic. So, in 1837, an expedition led by Lieutenant Napoleon L. Coste began searching along the dangerous Outer Banks for a new spot to build a lighthouse. Coste recommended Bodie Island, but Congress didn't listen, and they appropriated the money to build on Pea Island because, end quote, more vessels are lost there than on any other part of our coast. The locals had said more than 41 vessels had wrecked within 6 miles of that location in 10 years. Over the next 10 years, bureaucracy, insufficient funding, and complications acquiring land delayed the construction of the lighthouse for over 10 years. The hurricane hit in 1846, presumably during construction. This is the hurricane that opened Oregon Inlet, so they're pretty lucky that it didn't destroy their building location, although soon it wouldn't matter anyway. Congress acquired the land for $150 and construction began in 1846. Congress only appropriated $5,000 for the project. The man in the Treasury Department who approved lighthouse costs was more interested in saving money than building a proper lighthouse. The entire station ended up costing $11,050, which was still sharply low for the cost of a lighthouse. The man placed in charge really knew nothing about construction or building lighthouses. Engineer Francis Gibbons was handed a set of plans to build from, and after making numerous recommendations and being told to build the lighthouse by the plans, Gibbons was told to lay brick on unstable soil and was not allowed to drive piles to make the foundation solid. The lighthouse was completed in 1847 by Francis Gibbons, who later became a prominent lighthouse builder on the West Coast. When it was completed, it had an inferior revolving light system with 14 oil lamps and reflectors that didn't work. Later in 1854, a fourth-order Fresnel lens was installed, but the unstable foundation caused bricks to crack and leak, and the lighthouse leaned towards the sea. The government spent another $1,400 to attempt to fix it, but repairs would become too expensive, and the lighthouse was abandoned after only 11 years. By 1859, it had deteriorated beyond repair, and the lens was taken out. Which Congress had already prepared for this. A year earlier, they had already appropriated $25,000 to a new lighthouse, and by July 1st, 1859, a second lighthouse had been built, and it was 80 feet tall. It had a third-order Fresnel lens which could be seen 15 miles out to sea. And this lighthouse would stand for less than 2 years when Union troops during the Civil War began to capture Confederate forts along the coast. So retreating Confederate troops packed the tower with explosives and detonated it in fall of 1861. There was a report in November of 1862 that the lighthouse was still standing, but the Fresnel lens had been removed. No matter when it actually came down, the lighthouse did not survive the war. Union troops eventually discovered the lens in the rotunda of the North Carolina Capitol building, along with a huge stockpile of other expensive lighthouse apparatus. The areas of the old lighthouses are now underwater in Oregon Inlet, as the inlet shores are migrating south. I would like to ask questions in the future to find out if there are any remnants, although I feel the currents in the inlet would have destroyed or completely covered everything by now. Instead of rebuilding at the same location, the board originally planned to build 3 lighthouses between Cape Hatteras and Cape Henry, but later changed its mind. So on July 5, 1870, Congress appropriated $60,000 to build at Bodie Island, which was 1.5 miles north of the former site on property purchased from John Etheridge for $150. The build site was placed further inland, which provided more foundation stability. After almost a decade, the land was finally deeded on June 15, 1871, and Dexter Stetson was hired to build the tower after he had finished building Cape Hatteras. He used the same octagonal foundation technique, which was a new innovative technique to the construction of lighthouses. They placed stacked timber pilings below the ground, topped by an octagonal base of granite blocks left over from building Hatteras. In the year it took to build, 6 vessels ran aground nearby. The damages amounted to $133,000, which exceeded the expense in building the lighthouse. Bodie Lighthouse was officially opened and lit on October 1, 1872. It was twice the height as the previous lighthouse and had used a lot of leftover materials from Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Most of those materials were transported in a 6-foot deep channel built on the sound side of the island between Hatteras and Bodie. Now, Bodie Lighthouse stands along the shore of the Outer Banks, helping mariners along the graveyard of the Atlantic, which is now hugely helped by GPS navigation. It is one of only a few brick lighthouses still in operation, and one of very few that still uses its original first-order Fresnel lens. This lens is around 145 years old. It has been repaired over the years as well as converted to electricity. A little bit of side knowledge, the first lightkeeper of Bodie Lighthouse was paid an annual salary of only $400, and it's hard to imagine surviving an entire year on only $400, but prices at the time were a lot different than they are now. On October 29, 1872, 11 days after opening, a flock of geese flew into the lens, seriously damaging it, so a screen was installed to protect the lens. In the first 10 years, the lighthouse's biggest enemy was lightning. The stairwell acted as a lightning rod and formed cracks on the interior walls. A keeper received a severe shock that left his lower body numb for a long period of time. A conducting cable was recommended, but it took another strike in 1884 before a cast iron plate was approved and buried in the ground with a cable running up to the lamp. In 1898, Bodie Island received its first telephone. The War Department thought lighthouses could help national defense if they were connected. On September 19, 1932, the lighthouse received electricity after being lit by oil lamp for over 60 years, and eventually became fully automated by 1940. In 1939, the U.S. Coast Guard took over operation of the Bodie Island Lighthouse. During World War II, the U.S. Navy used the tower as a lookout for German U-boats. The Coast Guard handed over the property to the National Park Service on October 15, 1963. Minus the lighthouse itself, they kept 100 feet of the property on each side of the lighthouse. On July 13, year 2000, the Coast Guard handed over the lighthouse to the National Park Service. The lens was still the responsibility of the Coast Guard, though. In 2003, as the putty holding the prisms degraded, the Coast Guard announced its intention to remove the Fresnel lens and upgrade it to a modern optic lens. There was a public outcry against removing it and destroying history. In 2004, the lighthouse was in such disrepair that there were barriers built around it to keep people from getting under it after 2 cast iron chunks fell from the top. On April 25, 2005, the lens was officially transferred to the Cape Hatteras National Seashore Park Service during a ceremony. In 2007, repairs were discussed, but the recession in 2007-2008 nearly saw the repairs fade away, but by 2009, $3 million in funding was approved. Restoration began in August 2009. By March 2010, the outside scaffolding was 100% complete, while the inside scaffolding was only 50% complete. Restoration was stopped in spring 2011 after significant new structural integrity issues were found with the main support beams under the balcony. Funding was too costly to finish with the original budget, so in March 2011 all of the scaffolding was removed. In August 2011, Hurricane Irene blew out some of the newly restored lantern room glass and tore away the protective shroud covering the lantern room. Flooding also caused the floors in the keepers' quarters to collapse. In 2011, $1.6 million in additional funding was regained, bringing the total to around $5 million, and repairs were completed in March 2013. The official relighting ceremony was held on April 18, 2013, and opened to the public for climbing the next day. The light rotates every 27.5 seconds and can be seen 19 miles away at sea. I fully recommend visiting the Outer Banks and visiting all of the lighthouses, which can be done in one day. You can climb all of the lighthouses except for Ocracoke Lighthouse, which has not been restored on the inside yet. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you learned a little bit about Bodie Lighthouse. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. I certainly enjoyed making the video, so if you would like to see more like it, hit the subscribe button and let me know what you thought in the comments. See you in the next video and have a good one.